Corrupt police with racist motives stop a White House advisor, ending in tragedy. Alex Parker was used to the hustle and bustle of Washington, D.C. As a senior advisor at the White House, his life was fast-paced, with long days filled with meetings, reports, and the constant pressure of national security concerns. The weight of the country's future often rested on his shoulders, and he was no stranger to the high stakes of his job. Today was no different. On this particular morning, the sky was gray, and the streets of the city were filled with the usual rush of commuters. But for Alex, today held special importance. He was scheduled to present a new security initiative to the president, a plan that could change the way the nation approached global intelligence. The meeting was set for noon, and Alex knew that his role in shaping this policy was critical. He couldn't afford any delays. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard as he navigated through the thickening traffic. It was 10:45 a.m., and he still had plenty of time to get to the meeting. The usual route would take him through a quieter stretch of the city, cutting through residential neighborhoods before reaching the bustling streets near the White House. Alex was familiar with this area, and although it was a bit out of the way, it was often faster than trying to navigate through the heavier downtown traffic. As he drove, his mind wasn't on the road ahead, but on the discussions he would have in just a few hours. The president had been under pressure from international leaders to improve relations with foreign allies, especially those in Europe and the Middle East. Alex's plan had been carefully crafted to address these concerns while strengthening the country's own defense systems. It had taken months of research, late-night calls with experts, and countless hours of drafting and revising. But now, it was all coming down to this one moment. Suddenly, Alex's thoughts were interrupted by the flashing lights of a police car in his rearview mirror. The sudden burst of blue and red seemed out of place in the quiet neighborhood. He looked up, checking to make sure he wasn't speeding or violating any traffic laws. He wasn't. His speedometer read a steady 35 miles per hour, right on the mark for this residential area. His fingers instinctively tightened around the steering wheel as he pulled over to the side of the road. He had been pulled over a few times in his life, but this felt different. Something about the way the officer's lights blinked on and off made him uneasy. He had never been one to back down from an encounter, but the idea of being delayed now, when time was so precious, was frustrating. Still, he knew the drill: stay calm, cooperate, and get through it as quickly as possible. Alex rolled down the window as the officer approached. The officer, a tall man with dark hair and a stern expression, didn't speak immediately. Instead, he peered into the car, his eyes scanning Alex from head to toe before he finally spoke. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his voice firm but not aggressive. Alex nodded politely. "I'm not sure. I don't think I was speeding, officer." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked Alex over once more. There was something about the way he studied him that felt off. Alex couldn't put his finger on it, but the officer's tone had shifted, now more direct, almost accusing. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, his tone growing sharper. "I'm on my way to a meeting," Alex explained, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket to grab his identification. "I'm an advisor at the White House. I'm due for a presentation soon." The officer's expression didn't change. Instead of acknowledging Alex's position, he simply asked, "A White House advisor, huh?" His tone was dismissive, almost as if the title meant nothing to him. "And what's your business in this part of town?" Alex felt the unease in his stomach turn into something stronger. "I'm just driving through. I've lived in this city for years," the officer interrupted him. "I don't think you should be driving this fast through here. This is a quiet neighborhood. You ought to be more careful." Alex blinked. "I wasn't speeding. I've been driving carefully." "Is there something else?" The officer paused, glancing over his shoulder as another police car slowly came to a stop behind Alex's vehicle. Alex wasn't sure what was happening now, but he was starting to feel like this wasn't just a routine stop. The second officer stepped out of the car, a shorter man with a sharp jawline, and approached from the passenger's side. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching Alex through the window. "Everything okay here?" the second officer asked his partner. The first officer nodded, then turned back to Alex. "Yeah, just making sure this guy isn't up to anything suspicious." Alex felt a flicker of frustration. "Look, officer, I'm just on my way to work. I don't know why I'm being stopped, but I'm late for a very important meeting." Could you please just give me my ticket and let me go? The first officer leaned down again, his face just inches from Alex's. You don't get to tell me what to do, pal. I'll decide how this goes. His voice had taken on a venomous tone that Alex hadn't expected. He was still trying to make sense of the situation, his patience wearing thin. Is there a problem, officer? Alex asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but his heart was pounding now. Something about this whole interaction felt wrong, like he was being targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with the law. You just need to calm down, Mr. White House advisor, the officer sneered, his voice laced with sarcasm. Just because you work in the government doesn't mean you're above the law. He stood up straighter, glancing at his partner with a look that Alex couldn't quite decipher. Alex's heart began to race as he realized this wasn't about a simple traffic stop. The officer's words carried a subtle but unmistakable hint of disdain, the kind of disdain that was usually reserved for people seen as outsiders. Listen, I'm just trying to do my job, Alex said, his voice now tinged with frustration. I need to get to my meeting. Could you please let me go? The officer stared at him for a long moment as if evaluating him. Finally, the officer spoke again, but this time his words hit with a heavier weight. I don't trust people like you, he said quietly, almost to himself. Alex's blood ran cold. He had heard that phrase before, used in different ways, but the impact was the same. People like you. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was something far more personal, and Alex was beginning to understand that this situation was spiraling out of control. The officer's partner moved slightly behind Alex's car, out of his line of sight, and Alex could feel the tension rising with every second that passed. His mind raced as he realized he was in a position where he might not be able to talk his way out of this. Suddenly, the officer spoke again, this time with a dangerous calmness. Step out of the vehicle. Alex's mind raced as the officer's words hung in the air. Step out of the vehicle. His stomach tightened as he instinctively glanced toward the side mirror, his eyes catching a glimpse of the second officer standing behind him. His pulse quickened, but he knew there was no choice. The tension in the air was palpable, and the officer's posture suggested that this wasn't a simple traffic stop anymore. For a moment, Alex hesitated, weighing his options. His fingers hovered over the door handle, and in that brief pause, he considered calling for help. But then he realized that if this were to escalate any further, he'd need to stay calm and not provoke them further. His experience in high-pressure situations kicked in. He was no stranger to tense moments in meetings, but this felt different. This was personal. Alex slowly opened the door, the creak of the metal sounding louder than it should have in the tense silence. He swung his legs out and stood up, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The officers were watching him closely, their eyes sharp, their hands hovering just near their weapons. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, as if every movement he made was being scrutinized. Walk around to the front of your car, the officer ordered again, his voice laced with authority, but also something else, something that sent a chill down Alex's spine. It was almost as if the officer was trying to intimidate him, trying to assert dominance. Alex didn't say a word as he took a step forward, his shoes crunching against the gravel. He could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, but everything else seemed muffled, like he was in a vacuum. The second officer didn't speak either, but his presence felt like a silent threat. Alex's heart pounded louder in his chest with each step he took. He was trying to keep his cool, but he could feel the anxiety rising. When he reached the front of the car, he turned to face the officers. The first officer stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, studying him intently. The second officer was positioned a little farther back, his posture stiff and unyielding. There was an uncomfortable stillness in the air. Neither officer made a move, and for a moment, Alex wondered what was going through their minds. He kept his voice steady as he spoke, trying to maintain control of the situation. I'm just trying to get to my meeting, Alex said, keeping his tone neutral. This is unnecessary. I haven't done anything wrong. The first officer finally spoke, but his words were laced with sarcasm. You know, people like you don't usually take kindly to being pulled over. His voice was harsh, as if his anger was bubbling just under the surface. Alex's eyes widened slightly, the officer's words hitting him harder than he expected. People like you? What did that mean? The words were deliberately vague, but they carried an underlying hostility that Alex couldn't ignore. He'd heard similar tones in meetings, but they were usually masked by professionalism. This was something else. This wasn't about his driving. It was something much deeper. "Look, I understand your job is to ensure the safety of the streets, but this doesn't make sense," Alex said, his voice tight with frustration. He didn't want to provoke the situation any more than it already had been, but he couldn't understand why he was being treated this way. The officer took a step forward and Alex flinched slightly. The officer's voice dropped, but there was an edge to it now, something menacing. "Your kind thinks you're above the law, don't you? You think just because you work at the White House, you can do whatever you want." Alex's stomach turned at the words. His kind? He was a White House advisor, someone who had worked tirelessly for years, sacrificing personal time and energy for the greater good of the country. To be reduced to your kind was jarring, but he forced himself to stay composed. This was not the time to lose his cool. "I'm just trying to do my job," Alex replied, his voice shaking slightly, but he kept his ground. "I'm here to serve my country. This is not the way to handle things." The officer seemed to ignore Alex's words completely, his focus elsewhere. He was scanning Alex's face, studying him like a puzzle, his eyes cold and unblinking. Then, without warning, the officer stepped closer, his breath hot against Alex's ear. "You've been walking around here with that smug look on your face, thinking you're untouchable. But you're not." The second officer shifted position, and Alex could see him move out of the corner of his eye. His hands were on his belt, but he didn't seem to be making any aggressive moves. Still, the sensation of being surrounded, outnumbered, sent a wave of dread through Alex's chest. He tried to steady his breath, not wanting to show weakness. This wasn't the time to back down, but he was unsure what exactly was happening. "Is that why you stopped me?" Alex asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Because I work at the White House? Because of where I'm from? This is ridiculous." The officer scoffed and took another step closer. "Maybe it's not about who you are, maybe it's about what you represent. People like you don't belong in places like this. You're not welcome." Alex's face flushed with anger, but he kept his emotions in check. He couldn't let this officer get under his skin. If he lost his temper, it could make everything worse. But the officer's words were clearly designed to provoke him, to make him feel smaller, less significant. "I belong here just as much as anyone else," Alex said, his voice rising slightly, "and this behavior is unacceptable." The first officer took a step back, shaking his head. "I think it's time for you to come with us." Before Alex could react, the second officer reached out, grabbing him by the arm. Alex jerked back instinctively, but the grip tightened. He had no intention of letting them take him without a fight, but he knew that any sudden move could be misinterpreted, and he wasn't about to give them a reason to escalate things further. "Don't touch me," Alex snapped, his voice sharp. "I've done nothing wrong." But the officer didn't let go. Instead, the officer's grip grew firmer. Alex felt his heart pounding harder now, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could feel the officer's fingers digging into his skin, and it took everything he had to resist the urge to push the officer's hand away. "You'll regret this," the officer muttered, his words low but dangerous. For a moment, Alex stood there, completely frozen, trying to comprehend what was happening. His mind raced, but it was as if time itself had slowed down. Everything felt surreal. This was a situation he had never expected to find himself in, not in this city, not with this much at stake. But then, something snapped. The officer's hand tightened again, and Alex felt a spark of defiance rise within him. He wasn't going to let them control the narrative. He wasn't going to let his identity be used against him. He had rights, and he knew it. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Alex said firmly, meeting the officer's eyes. The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't have a choice." As the situation continued to escalate, Alex's mind raced. He knew he had to find a way out, but his options were narrowing by the second. Would he be able to escape this nightmare unscathed? Or was he already caught in a trap he couldn't escape? Alex's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening as the officer's hand tightened its grip on his arm. The pressure was unbearable, and every muscle in his body screamed to pull away, to break free from the officer's hold. But he knew that any sudden movement could lead to something far worse. The moment of silence stretched, thick with tension, as the two officers stood like statues, sizing him up, waiting for him to make the next move. His mind was racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He'd been stopped for no reason, humiliated, and now his body was being restrained. Every part of him screamed for justice, for a way out, but it felt like the situation was spiraling too fast, too uncontrollably. Alex kept his voice steady as he spoke again, trying to remain calm, though he could feel the anger rising within him. "Let go of me," Alex said firmly, his eyes locking with the first officer's. "This is not right. You're making a mistake." But the officer's grip only tightened, and the coldness in his eyes deepened. The officer didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his face unreadable, his hands poised and ready to act. Alex could feel the tension growing between them, like an invisible force pulling them closer to the edge. The second officer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was low, almost threatening. "You don't get to tell us what's right, mister." Parker, his words hit Alex like a slap in the face, colder than anything he had expected. The officer's voice carried a tone of absolute authority, as if he were speaking to someone beneath him, someone with no right to question his actions. Alex felt the heat rise in his face. The officer was treating him like a criminal, not as someone with a position of responsibility in the country. The injustice of it burned through him. He was a trusted advisor, a man who had dedicated his life to his country. And here he was, being treated like a common criminal. No respect, no recognition, only hostility. The shock of the situation felt like a weight on his chest, making it harder to breathe, to think clearly. "Please," Alex said, his voice softening but still strong. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get to a meeting. You're making a mistake." The first officer didn't budge. Instead, he looked at Alex as if he were beneath him, as if Alex's words had no value. There was a moment when Alex thought the officer might actually let go, might recognize the absurdity of the situation, but it passed in an instant. The officer seemed immune to reason, to anything other than his own distorted view of power. "We don't make mistakes, mister." "Parker," the officer said with an unsettling calmness, "you're going to learn that the hard way." The second officer took a step forward, his hands still near his holster. "I think it's time you came with us," he said, his voice still dripping with condescension. Alex could feel the air grow thick with tension, every second stretching longer than the last. This wasn't just a stop, it was becoming something much darker. The officers weren't just enforcing the law, they were trying to impose their own sense of power, their own twisted version of control. And Alex wasn't sure how much longer he could stay calm before it all came crashing down. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He had to think clearly. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. His mind flickered through possible scenarios, every one of them filled with danger. If he resisted, it could escalate into violence. If he complied, he might end up in handcuffs, dragged through a system that didn't care about his position or his rights. "Let's talk about this," Alex said, his voice tight. "We don't need to do this. I'll give you my ID, you can check everything, and we can go our separate ways. There's no reason for this to escalate further." But the officers were no longer listening. The second officer stepped even closer, his eyes fixed on Alex with a look of disdain. "You don't get to call the shots here. You're not in charge, Mr. Parker, not today." Alex's chest tightened with frustration, but he fought to keep his voice steady. "I am in charge of my own fate," he said, trying to make the officer see reason. "You have no right to treat me like this." For a moment, the officers stood still, their eyes locked on Alex as if weighing his words. But then, without warning, the first officer took a step back, gesturing toward the second officer with a nod. "Cuff him," he said quietly, almost as if he were giving a casual command. Alex's stomach dropped. The reality of the situation hit him all at once. They weren't just going to let him go. This wasn't a simple traffic violation anymore. They had already made up their minds about him. He was guilty simply by virtue of who he was. And now they were going to make sure he paid for it. The second officer moved quickly, and before Alex could react, his arms were being pulled behind his back, and the cold, unforgiving metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The pressure of the cuffs sent a shock through his body, and he couldn't help but wince. "This isn't happening," Alex muttered under his breath, trying to hold onto the last shred of his dignity. He had worked so hard for his position, for the respect that came with it, and now it was all being stripped away. In a matter of seconds, he had gone from a respected White House advisor to a criminal in the eyes of these officers. The officers didn't care. They didn't care about his position, his career, or the years of hard work he had put in. They didn't care about the countless hours he had spent crafting policies for the good of the nation. All they saw was someone they could target, someone who wasn't like them, someone they could push around. As the officers led him toward their squad car, Alex felt a rush of panic surge through him. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let them get away with it. But in that moment, all he could do was follow them, each step heavier than the last. The cold reality of the situation began to sink in. He was being treated like an enemy, and no one was going to stop it. Not the White House, not anyone. The system that he had spent his life supporting was failing him, and he could feel the weight of that failure pressing down on him, making each step harder to take. The officers shoved him into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut with a deafening thud. Alex sat there handcuffed in disbelief. His mind raced, but it felt like everything had become a blur. His future, his career, everything he had worked for seemed to slip away with each passing second. But in that moment, one thing was clear: he was trapped. And there was no way out, at least not yet. The cold metal of the squad car door seemed to press against Alex, making it feel even smaller, even more suffocating. He sat in the back, his wrists still bound by the handcuffs that dug uncomfortably into his skin. His mind was racing. He could feel the panic creeping in, but he forced himself to stay calm. His life had always been about keeping a cool head in moments of crisis, but this was different. This wasn't a policy debate or a diplomatic negotiation. This was real, and the consequences felt much more immediate. The squad car pulled away from the curb with a slight jolt, and Alex's stomach lurched as it started down the street. The sound of the engine was the only noise in the air, accompanied by the distant hum of traffic. It felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't wake up from. He had worked his whole life to get to this point, to be someone who made a difference. And now, here he was, trapped in the back of a police car, handcuffed and powerless. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a heavy cloud. He didn't know where they were taking him. His mind was too fogged with confusion and anger to make sense of it. All he knew was that he had to get out of this situation. He couldn't let it end like this. He had to fight back. But how? He was alone, trapped in the back of a police car with no one around to help. The officers had made it clear that they weren't interested in hearing his side of the story. The hum of the car seemed to drown out all other thoughts as he tried to think through his options. His phone. Of course, his phone. It was the only way he could contact someone, anyone who could help him. He had to let someone know what was happening before it was too late. Alex shifted his position in the cramped backseat, trying to reach into his jacket pocket without making any sudden movements that might draw attention. His hands, still confined by the handcuffs, made it difficult to maneuver. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and the officers might think he was trying something. His fingers brushed against his phone, and for a brief moment he thought he could pull it out, but the cuffs were too tight, making it nearly impossible. A sense of urgency flooded him as the seconds ticked by. He had to act fast. He couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever they had planned for him. He needed to let someone know what was happening, let them know he hadn't done anything wrong. He needed to get the message out. Just then the car slowed and Alex's heart skipped a beat. Were they stopping? He leaned forward slightly, trying to peer through the tinted windows. The car came to a complete stop, and for a brief moment there was only silence. Was this it? Were they about to drag him out of the car and make everything worse? He braced himself, but then, to his relief, he heard the sound of a phone ringing. Someone was calling. His mind immediately snapped back to the present. He needed to reach out to someone. Quickly, he twisted his body, trying to free his hands from the awkward angle he had been holding them in. He felt a sharp pull in his shoulder, but he ignored it, focusing solely on his phone. He could hear the ringing stop and then the sound of someone picking up on the other end. "Hello?" The voice on the other side was calm, unfamiliar, but with an edge of concern. "Help," Alex said, his voice low but desperate. "I've been stopped by the police. They're taking me somewhere. I don't know where, but they're making up charges. I need you to call someone. Anyone." He heard a pause on the other end, then the voice spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Who is this? What's going on?" "It's Alex Parker," he said quickly. "I work at the White House. They've stopped me and they won't let me go. I don't know what's happening, but I need help." Alex's words spilled out in a rush, his mind still racing. He could hear the other person typing quickly, presumably searching for contacts or resources. Every second felt like an eternity. He could almost hear the officer's footsteps outside the car, and he tensed at the sound, but he didn't want to be overheard. The officer had already shown hostility, and if they found out Alex was calling for help, it might give them even more reason to escalate the situation. "Who do I need to contact?" Alex pressed, trying to stay calm. "Get in touch with the right people. Let them know where I am. Tell them to move fast." "I'm contacting someone now. Stay calm," the voice said, though there was an edge of panic beneath the calmness. Alex could tell they were trying to act quickly. The line went silent again as the person on the other end worked their contacts. Alex tried to take deep breaths, but every inch of him felt tense. He glanced out the window, but all he could see were the dark shapes of buildings passing by. Was he being driven to a station, or was something worse waiting ahead? His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. After a long, agonizing pause, the voice came back on the line. "Okay, we've alerted your team. They're working on it. We'll get you out of there. Just stay calm and keep your phone on." Alex nodded, even though the person on the other end couldn't see him. He didn't know who this was or who exactly had been contacted, but he took some small comfort in the fact that someone was aware of his situation now. The weight on his chest felt slightly lighter, but the fear still gnawed at him. He was still in the hands of these officers, and he didn't know how long it would be before things escalated again. Just then the car started moving again, the tires humming against the pavement as they picked up speed. Alex's thoughts raced. Where were they taking him? What would happen next? He had no answers, only questions. He could feel the heat of his phone still pressed against his ear, and he realized the voice on the other end was still there, waiting for him to say something. But Alex didn't know what to say. His options felt limited. He had done all he could for now. All he could do was wait. The phone call was his lifeline. It was the only thing keeping him connected to the world outside the squad car, to the people who cared about him and the ones who could help. It was his last thread of hope. As the car continued to move, the streets outside blurred into a series of indistinct shapes and colors. Alex's mind wandered back to his job, to the work he had done for years. Years spent on policies, on national security, on protecting his country. And yet here he was, sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed, unable to escape. It felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour, and yet there was no sign of the car slowing down or stopping. Alex held onto the small hope that the people he had contacted would reach out to the right authorities, that somehow things would turn around. But in the back of his mind, the fear lingered. He didn't know if he could trust these officers. They had shown him nothing but hostility, and all he could do was wait. The sun was beginning to dip behind the city skyline, painting the streets in a dull, golden light. The advisor sat in their car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady the rapid heartbeat they felt in their chest. They had been pulled over unexpectedly by 2 local police officers, and something about the situation didn't feel right. The officers were not speaking politely. Instead, they were barking orders and glaring with a kind of cold intensity that made the advisor's stomach churn. Every instinct told them this was more than a routine stop. The advisor took a deep breath, trying to remind themselves to stay calm. They spoke in a firm but respectful tone. "Officer, can you please explain why I was stopped?" One of the officers leaned closer, his face tight with irritation. "You know why. Don't play games with us." His voice carried a sharp edge, the kind that cut through any pretense of fairness. The advisor swallowed hard, realizing that reasoning with these officers might not work. They reached for their phone, hoping a call could help. But the officers noticed and shook their heads. "Hands where we can see them," the other officer said. The advisor froze, feeling the pressure in the air tighten around them like a vice. For a moment, everything was silent except for the faint hum of cars passing by. The advisor tried again, keeping their voice steady. "I am here on official government business. Please, let's handle this professionally. I have an important meeting to attend." But the officers were unmoved. Their eyes held something harsh and unyielding, a kind of bias that the advisor couldn't escape. It wasn't just about the law, it felt personal, targeted. The advisor's mind raced. They thought about the consequences, not just for themselves, but for the people depending on their work. Could one encounter like this undo years of dedication? The tension in the car grew. The officers moved closer, their gestures impatient, almost threatening. The advisor noticed a passerby glance at the scene, hesitation in their eyes. No one stepped forward. Everyone seemed frozen in uncertainty. The advisor's chest tightened as a mix of fear and frustration washed over them. They were trained to negotiate, to stay composed under pressure, but this felt beyond anything their training could prepare them for. "I promise to comply," the advisor said again. "Just please explain what I did wrong. I want to cooperate." One officer muttered something under his breath, but the advisor caught the tone. There was no intention of cooperation on the other side. The advisor's mind spun with possibilities. If they stayed calm, maybe they could defuse the situation. If they argued, it might escalate. Every option seemed trapped between danger and injustice. Time stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. The advisor's hands were trembling, and their voice betrayed a subtle quiver even as they tried to remain composed. "Officer, please, I am asking for your understanding," they said. Their words were measured, polite, but filled with a quiet desperation. Suddenly, one of the officers slammed the door of the patrol car, the noise echoing sharply in the narrow street. The advisor flinched. The other officer took a step forward, eyes hard, hands moving with deliberate certainty. It was clear that no matter what was said, the officers had already decided the outcome. The advisor realized they were trapped in a situation beyond reason, and an overwhelming feeling of helplessness settled in. The advisor thought about their family, their parents, their siblings, and the young niece they had promised to see at school the next week. Thoughts of unfinished work, unspoken words, and lost opportunities crowded their mind. It was not just about them anymore. It was about the ripple effects of this moment, how quickly a life could be changed forever. The advisor's voice shook slightly as they made one last appeal. "I am only asking for fairness. Please let me handle this calmly. I am committed to obeying the law." Their hands moved slowly, showing openness, trying to communicate trustworthiness. But the officers remained unyielding. The atmosphere thickened with tension, every second dragging heavily. The advisor realized words alone could not reach them. They had to rely on patience, on reading every movement, every nuance, and hoping against hope that the situation would de-escalate. The advisor's mind flashed through memories of their life. The long nights of study, the moments of triumph, the times they had believed in the goodness of people. They thought about the core of their work, which was to serve and protect the rights of others, and the bitter irony of being caught in this moment of injustice. It made them tighten their jaw, summoning the courage to face the unknown with dignity. Time moved differently now. Each heartbeat felt amplified, each breath heavier. The advisor noticed the shadows growing long on the street, the sky darkening, as if the world itself was watching the unfolding drama. It was not just a personal moment. It felt historical, monumental, a confrontation between fairness and prejudice. Then, without any clear warning, the officers' behavior reached a final, irreversible point. They took actions that left the advisor with no room to maneuver, no chance to respond safely. In those final moments, the advisor tried to stay composed, tried to reason, tried to appeal to decency. But it was clear that logic and morality could not break through the wall of corruption and bias that surrounded them. The advisor's mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, memories, and regrets. They thought of the people who counted on them, the family who loved them, and the ideals they had fought for tirelessly. Every memory, every lesson, every promise flashed before their eyes in a blur of light and emotion. And then the moment ended. The advisor's struggle concluded not in triumph, not in justice, but in a silent, tragic stillness. The world seemed to pause, the street frozen in a heavy quiet that was almost unbearable. The passerby who had watched now looked on in shock, powerless to undo what had happened. In the moments that followed, the advisor's absence was felt deeply. The patrol cars pulled away, the street returning to its normal rhythm as if nothing had occurred, but the emotional weight lingered. The advisor's story, their commitment to justice, and the ideals they had lived for were now a testament to both brilliance and vulnerability. News traveled quickly. Those who knew the advisor's work felt an immediate, deep sense of loss. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers connected to the story were shaken. Discussions began about fairness, accountability, and the invisible forces of bias that could turn everyday encounters into life-altering tragedies. Yet, even in this heartbreaking conclusion, the advisor's dignity remained intact. They had faced impossible circumstances with composure and courage. Their life, though tragically cut short, became a symbol, a reminder of how fragile trust in authority can be when unchecked, and how essential it is to fight for justice at every level. The city around them moved on, but the story remained. People reflected on the events, feeling the weight of sorrow, the need for change, and the memory of a life devoted to service. The advisor's legacy, though overshadowed by tragedy, became a beacon for reform, empathy, and accountability. It was a stark, powerful lesson about human vulnerability, the cost of prejudice, and the importance of integrity. Even as the sun set completely and darkness settled over the streets, the advisor's courage lingered in memory. In the hearts of those who learned their story, their fight for fairness lived on. The tragic climax of that day became a turning point, not just for one life, but for the awareness of the many who would hear and remember. It was a story that demanded attention, reflection, and a commitment to making the world a place where such tragedy could never happen again. The city woke the next morning to the quiet hum of everyday life, but for many, the world felt strangely heavier. News of the advisor's tragic passing had already spread. Social media, newspapers, and television carried the story in every corner, and people who had never met the advisor were suddenly drawn into the weight of the loss. The advisor had been a rising star in public service, known for their intelligence, compassion, and dedication to improving lives. Now, the memory of their courage under pressure dominated conversations, headlines, and reflections. In homes across the city, families gathered around screens, reading and watching the unfolding story. Parents explained to their children that sometimes life could be unfair in ways that were difficult to understand, but that it was still important to act with integrity and fairness. Teachers in schools paused lessons to discuss justice, accountability, and courage, using the advisor's story as a real-life example of both dedication and vulnerability. Even strangers felt the weight of the story, recognizing that it reflected challenges present in many communities. Colleagues at the White House were stunned. They had known the advisor not just as a capable professional, but as someone who carried warmth and integrity into every room. Meetings were filled with hushed conversations, memories of shared projects, and disbelief at the loss. Some spoke quietly to each other about the advisor's tireless commitment to solving problems, to speaking truth even when it was difficult, and to standing up for fairness in the face of resistance. For many, the tragedy became a personal call to action, a reminder that one person's dedication could inspire countless others to continue the work, even when obstacles seemed overwhelming. At the advisor's family home, the atmosphere was heavy with grief, yet threaded with pride. Parents, siblings, and extended family members found themselves recalling moments of laughter, guidance, and encouragement. Stories from childhood were retold, how the advisor had always been curious, always eager to help, always searching for ways to make a difference. Every memory was tinged with sorrow now, but also with recognition of the character that had defined their life. Relatives gathered, supporting each other in silence and in shared conversation, knowing that the advisor's life, though tragically cut short, had made a meaningful impact on everyone who knew them. Political circles were shaken as well. Lawmakers, advisors, and government officials debated and discussed what had occurred. Questions were raised about accountability, fairness, and the systems that allowed moments of injustice to escalate unchecked. Some pushed for reviews of training, oversight, and public engagement to ensure that such incidents could be prevented in the future. The advisor's story became more than just a personal tragedy. It became a symbol of systemic issues that required attention. The conversations were long, the debates emotional, and the determination to create change strong, though tinged with sadness. Public vigils and memorials began to form in multiple locations. Citizens carried candles, flowers, and handwritten notes. People who had never met the advisor came to pay respects, drawn by the example of integrity and courage that the advisor had embodied. Speeches were made, tears were shed, and communities reflected on the fragility of life and the importance of standing up for fairness. What had started as an individual tragedy now became a shared experience, a moment for society to come together in remembrance and contemplation. Journalists and writers worked to capture the essence of the advisor's life. Articles highlighted the dedication, the daily efforts to improve society, and the quiet moments of care and mentorship that define the advisor's career. Reports emphasized that this loss was not just about a single life, but about the ideals the advisor had represented: honesty, service, and the courage to face challenges head-on. Stories recounted personal interactions, showing how the advisor had listened to concerns, guided colleagues, and remained committed to truth even when it was inconvenient. The narrative painted a picture of a person whose life, though brief, had touched countless others and left a legacy worth remembering. In schools and universities, educators used the advisor's life to encourage discussions about ethics, public service, and the importance of civic responsibility. Students debated questions about fairness, integrity, and the responsibilities of leadership. They were inspired not only by the tragedy, but by the way the advisor had carried themselves in moments of stress, maintaining dignity and commitment to principles even when the outcome was uncertain. Teachers encouraged students to reflect on their own roles in society, to consider how they could act with honesty and courage, and to recognize that even in a world with challenges, one person could influence the lives of many. Communities began organizing forums and discussions on improving interactions between citizens and law enforcement. Citizens, leaders, and policymakers came together to explore ways to prevent similar tragedies. They discussed training programs, dialogue initiatives, and systems for accountability. The advisor's story, though heart-wrenching, became a catalyst for conversations that might otherwise have been delayed or overlooked. People shared ideas, hopes, and aspirations for a society where respect, understanding, and fairness could guide interactions at every level. The advisor's dedication to service inspired a collective effort to strengthen ethical practices and build bridges of trust. Friends of the advisor found themselves reflecting deeply. They remembered shared lunches, late-night conversations about policy and dreams, and small acts of kindness that revealed the advisor's genuine character. They spoke of how the advisor had encouraged them to do better, to challenge themselves, and to care about the world beyond personal gain. Now, those same friends carried the weight of absence, but also a responsibility to continue the ideals the advisor had championed. Each conversation about the advisor became a reminder that one life, lived fully, could inspire many others long after it ended. Even those who had initially felt distant from the situation began to understand the significance. Conversations in workplaces, neighborhoods, and social gatherings turned toward reflection. People discussed how integrity mattered, how courage could take many forms, and how small actions, like listening, advocating, and standing up for fairness, could ripple outward. The advisor's story became a teaching moment for all, showing that dedication to principles, even in the face of injustice, had lasting value. The emotional response was matched by a quiet, internal reflection among many who had read or heard the story. Individuals considered their own lives, their interactions, and their responsibilities. Some realized they had overlooked opportunities to act with fairness or courage. Others felt motivated to strengthen their commitment to justice in everyday life. The advisor's life and death prompted not only mourning, but also introspection, inspiring a wave of renewed effort toward betterment, understanding, and community care. Government agencies and civic groups began to honor the advisor's work formally. Awards, scholarships, and programs were proposed to continue the advisor's vision of ethical public service. Young people aspiring to work in public service found a model to emulate, someone who had shown that even ordinary actions, guided by principle, could have extraordinary impact. By preserving the advisor's memory in these ways, communities ensured that their legacy would not fade, transforming tragedy into hope, inspiration, and actionable change. Even as time passed, the story of the advisor continued to resonate. People told it in family circles, schools, and offices. The lessons learned became part of civic consciousness. The advisor's life reminded everyone that integrity, courage, and dedication to fairness were ideals worth pursuing, even when outcomes were uncertain. The tragedy highlighted the fragility of life, but the response, reflection, action, and remembrance revealed the enduring strength of human resilience and empathy. Ultimately, the advisor's legacy was defined not by the sudden tragedy that ended their journey, but by the example they had set. a life lived with purpose, compassion, and unshakable commitment to doing what was right. Their story became a mirror, reflecting society's values, challenges, and potential. The city, the nation, and countless individuals were changed, learning that courage and dedication could inspire reform, reflection, and hope, even in the darkest of moments. Though the advisor was no longer present in the physical world, their ideals lived on. People continued to discuss, honor, and emulate the qualities that had defined their life. Families, communities, and institutions found strength in the memory of someone who had faced challenges with dignity and integrity. And in every reflection, every act of fairness, and every pursuit of justice, the advisor's story remained alive, a reminder that even in tragedy, human life could illuminate hope, change, and enduring inspiration.